Hey guys, welcome to the Stand-Up Review podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today we're reviewing Jim Jefferies' 2020 special, Intolerant. Let's get into it. This podcast is brought to you by our patrons. If you want to help support the podcast, then head on over to patreon.com/standupreview. With tiers starting at as little as £1, there are some great benefits, such as voting for which specials you want reviewed, Q&As, bloopers, early access to podcasts, exclusive podcasts, and many more. Sign up at patreon.com/standupreview, and thank you for your support. As a special limited time offer, anyone who becomes a patron during the month of July, regardless of which tier, can choose one stand-up special that will be reviewed on the podcast, as well as receiving the standard benefits for the tier you choose. This offer runs out on the 31st of July, so head on over to patreon.com/standupreview for this one-time deal.
So starting off with a bit of background, Jim Jefferies has been touring for over a decade. He's a massively successful comedian in Australia, the UK and the US. He's had a couple of TV shows, Legit and The Jim Jefferies Show. I've seen most of his specials. I'm a huge fan personally. This special came out the day before this podcast is being released, so obviously it's his latest. I was actually going to review one of his earlier specials, but then I saw this was coming out, so I'll put it off until now. In terms of his comedic style, Jim does a lot of storytelling and observational comedy. He also gets close to ranting at some times, but it's more just sort of aggressive joke telling. But with all that out of the way, let's get into the show itself. At the opening of the show, Jim receives a huge standing ovation, but he gets straight into jokes. The first bit is about drinking. He tells a story, then makes up a scene. There are not really any jokes, just a couple of funny stories, but they're funny enough on their own that he doesn't need to embellish them or anything like that. This bit has a very sudden ending. It kind of feels like he's in the middle of a joke and then he just moves on. It's a little bit weird and kind of takes you out of it for a second, but he goes on to talk about lactose-intolerant, and this is quite funny. Again, there's not really any jokes, he's just relying on the story being good. But to be honest, this is probably one of the less funny parts of the show. He tells a brief story about his dad, which is really good, before talking about millennials. Now, in this bit, he has more traditional jokes, and they're all still really good. He gets close to a rant at one point, but that kind of aggressive style of telling jokes is really his style anyway. After this, he switches it up to talking about fancy restaurants, and this is more observational comedy than his kind of storytelling beforehand. He slowly goes through the meal, and he's got a good mix of jokes and story, but it's much more observational than just what's happened. He uses this story of him going on a date to this fancy restaurant as kind of a backbone for a lot of the rest of the show. He goes off into talking about fat shaming, and he makes quite a serious point here, but he does it in a funny way. He's mostly telling jokes, but it's still very obvious the point he's trying to make, and it's a very good way of making a point within a comedy show. He then sort of transitions this into talking about animal testing. And what you notice throughout the show is that his jokes aren't necessarily formatted as the traditional set-up punchline. He'll kind of set up a scenario and then reel off a few punchlines for that scenario before setting something else up. It still works just as well, and he's definitely not the only person who does it. And it does fit that kind of close to rant style a lot better. And it's not as though that's the only style of jokes he uses, but I'd say that's kind of his go-to style of joke telling. In the next bit, he goes back to talking about the date a little bit more, and he talks about the cheeses on the date. He spends a lot of time sort of setting up the next bit here, but he keeps it funny. It's fairly obvious where he's going, but you're laughing throughout the setup. And he carries on the story, talking about the journey home from the restaurant, and he's still setting up the next bit, or I guess towards the end of the story. He's leading you along to what seems like a fairly obvious ending, but he does a good job of keeping the anticipation there and telling you jokes and splitting off from the main story again as he goes on to talk about women's routines. And this is a really good bit. He makes a point, but he's not really being serious about it. He's not trying to actually say anything. He's just kind of making a joke at the expense of women who spend a lot of time getting ready. And this bit has a fairly weird mix of jokes and story. It works well, but when you're watching it and kind of trying to analyse it a bit, which obviously most people aren't, but it does come across a little bit weird when you think about it too much, but it's still funny. He then talks about cancel culture, and this is much more serious. He's still making jokes, and it's not that serious. He makes it clear that he doesn't really give a fuck about it, but he still makes quite a good point. He then starts talking as though he's going back to the story of the journey home from the restaurant, but just doesn't discuss it again for a while. And it's very weird and a little bit awkward, but he just kind of stops and moves on to talking about allergies. And it's still a very funny bit, and it's his usual style and all that kind of stuff. But it's just the bringing up the backbone story just doesn't make any sense the way he does it here. Afterwards, he talks about the film industry, and he sets up this bit with an unrelated joke that he clearly just wanted to tell, and it is a really good joke. He makes a point about feminism and goes through a few examples, and they get funnier as they go along. The bit does build really well, but it kind of trails off into, and maybe this is supposed to be a different bit, but it's basically the same kind of thing. But he starts talking about different examples of problems within the film industry. It's a weird way of transitioning within the same bit, if it is the same bit, but he makes a couple of jokes and moves away from the seriousness of the first half of the bit. And again, it wasn't that serious, but Jim's shows are founded in nothing being taken seriously, so when he does say something that he actually thinks, he feels the need to lighten the mood within the same bit, because again, his ethos really is that this is just a comedy show, don't take anything seriously. In the next bit, he goes back to the story of his date, and this is a really great bit. He just tells the story, he doesn't need any jokes mixed in, it's really funny on its own. And Jim's storytelling is amazing. It's a very long bit, probably the longest bit of the show, but it doesn't get boring, and he holds your attention the entire time, and you're constantly laughing throughout the bit. This is definitely the best part of the show, and even though he's built up the ending of this story, and he's been telling it pretty much throughout the entire show, and he spends the entire second half of the show building up to this ending of the story, he still manages to get you. He still catches you out a little bit at the end, and he ends it in a very good way. This could have been the ending of the show, but he takes a minute to say that he's got a story about his mum that's very meaningful to him, and he tells a great story, and there's a really good punchline, and it is a good way to end the show with a shorter story and a strong punchline at the end. But like I said, he could have easily ended the show on the previous bit, and it would still have been a really good ending. But because of the meaning this bit has to him, I can see why he ended it in this way. And it's still amazing, and it still works perfectly as an ending. So in reality, he's kind of got two brilliant endings to the show. Now, a few extra things. In terms of callbacks, there's only one or two small callbacks, but they're nothing substantial. They work well, but they're not important parts of jokes or anything like that. As far as transitions are concerned, they can be a little bit awkward at times. He uses the story of the date as a backbone for a lot of different bits, which works really well, but sometimes he'll reference it and not talk about it at all, which feels odd. But apart from a couple of awkward moments, the general structure of the show is really good, and there is a story arc to the show that a lot of comedians don't bother to do. Not that it's the right way to do a show necessarily, it just can help the structure quite a lot, and it does in this show. Jim's stage persona has changed a lot in the last 10 years or so. He used to use a lot of dark humour and was a quote-unquote offensive comedian, but that's slowly changed, and he's done really well to maintain his persona. He's still very much himself. I just think he's changed as a person in the last 10 years or so. I think around the time he had his son there was a significant change. He does address it a little bit within the show, but he still doesn't care, and he's still on the verge of rant a lot of the time. I'd probably say it's angry comedy, if that makes any sense. But it'll be interesting to compare his stage persona now and in one of his earlier specials. As for the audience, Jim has built an audience for himself. They know what to expect from him at this point. The audience laugh at all the points that you laugh at, and it does help the show flow as normal, but you don't really notice them particularly as you're watching. Like I said, they're laughing as you're laughing, and apart from the huge standing ovation at the start, there's nothing really of note there. Now, some overall thoughts to finish on. Jim Jefferies is one of my favourite comedians, and even though this wasn't his best work, or at least not my favourite of his shows, it was still really good. As I said earlier, his storytelling is unbelievably good, and his ability to hold your attention and keep you laughing throughout a long story is probably one of the best of any comedian, and he does that really well in parts of this special. As for an overall rating, this is partly based on the fact that it's not my favourite special of his, and if it was the first I'd seen of him, I would probably score it higher, but I'm going to say a 7 out of 10.
Thanks for listening to the Stand Up Review podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, be sure to subscribe to get new episodes as soon as they come out every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Check out our Patreon for some awesome benefits at patreon.com/standupreview. If you have any thoughts or suggestions for the show, whether it be a new segment or a show you'd like us to review, let us know on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter at standupreview and give us a follow while you're over there. Feel free to share this or any of our other podcasts on any social media platform. Have a great day and we'll see you for the next episode. This podcast is made possible by our patron, Brad Oldfield. If you would also like to support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com/standupreview and thank you for your support.